Blockheads. Happy Blockheads Wednesday. Brigitte is our designer of the week, Brigitte of Zen Chic, and she has brought a fun block for us and kind of a challenging one if you are not terribly familiar with foundation paper piecing. So this is what the finished block looks like, or this is my finished block. And I just wanted to share some of my tips and tricks and kind of walk y'all through how to do some foundation paper piecing. So we're going to start from the very beginning. We're going to take a look at the pattern. So you're going to want to print out your pattern. So if you don't have it printed out yet, you might want to pause this video and go print out your pattern because we're going to walk through it a little bit. And then I'll talk about how to cut your fabrics and how to line everything up, some tips for stitching and pressing, and hopefully when it's all done, you'll have a block that you'll be very proud of. And I can't wait to see everybody's blocks this week. So go grab your pattern and let's get started. Okay, so let's talk about the pattern a little bit. So normally when you are looking at a Blockheads pattern and you look at the lettered coloring block, it's just letters. This time we have letters and numbers. The black and white version that we got from Brigitte had what would look like 4 fabrics. Of course, you can mix it up and do whatever you'd like. I've got a whole page of coloring blocks back here, and they're numbered and lettered to help you decide on fabric placement. You know, the reason why we have an A segment over here, and that's why I can't just use an A, because within A segment, the A segment, we have 4 different pieces, right? So that's why you have A1, A2, A3, and A4. Now this is important. When you look at the template here, here's the A section, and I was just pointing it out on the letter diagram that A is over here. And so it's good to remember that when you're doing foundation paper piecing, you're actually working in reverse. So here's my finished block, and here's a reverse. So you can see here's A1, but this is the back of my block, and when I flip it over, A1 is over here, just like in the letter diagram. So I have created your coloring block as though it's fabric face up, but your templates are fabric face down. An important tip for printing your paper piecing templates, this pattern, is to make sure that when you go to print, you print actual size. Don't print fit to screen or fit to paper. You need to print at 100%. And on every page of your templates, there's a gauge, and this should be an inch when you print it. So after you print everything, especially if you've never printed a foundation paper piecing template before, get a ruler and make sure that the gauge is correct before you start cutting and sewing. So this is an inch, so my gauge is correct, and I have printed correctly, and my template is the right size. Another thing you can do is confirm that this dotted line is your seam allowance, and the solid line is the stitch line, and you can make sure that that's a 1/4 inch, and it is. The next thing you're going to want to do is cut out your templates. And these don't have to be cut out perfectly. I usually cut, an extra 1/8 or 1/4 even inch around there. When we're done sewing all the fabrics onto our templates, we're gonna trim along this dotted seam allowance line. So you don't have to cut them out perfectly to start with, but you do need to cut them off of the page and just do a quick rough cut and get all of the paper templates cut out before you start sewing. So I'm going to cut out my templates, and then we'll move over to the cutting board and start working with cutting our fabrics. Okay, here's a tip for cutting your fabric pieces so that you have a little less waste in advance, and to help you line up your fabrics with the template. So start by printing an extra template out, like I've done here, and I've cut it out. And then you want to cut each section right on the line so that you have templates for those sections.
Okay, so I've cut these out. So these are, you know, the actual size of the pieces, of the segments of my template. Now what I can do is I can take my fabric squares that I have already cut according to the cutting instructions, and I can use these to cut my templates in the right shape. And I'm going to add 1/2 inch all the way around. So you see, I've given you cutting instructions that give you oversized pieces. So if you wanted to take this and just work with it like this, you totally could. So you can kind of tell I've got lots of extra room around here, but it makes it a little bit harder to line everything up, especially if you're new to paper piecing. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use this, and I'm going to go ahead and, just like when I start sewing, I'm going to have the wrong side of my fabric to the wrong side of my paper template. I'm going to go ahead and cut that way too, just to make things easier on myself. So I'll cut these out, and then I'll have the right shape already, and that's going to help me line up my fabric with my template. So let me do that. Okay, now you see I've got all my pieces cut out. So when I'm ready to start putting them in place and sewing them, they're just a little bit more in line with the template. And it's going to be a little bit easier to line up my edges and know where, you know, that my fabric is in the right shape, roughly. Okay, so I'm ready to sew my first pieces to my segment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start, you always go alphabetically and numerically. So I want to place my A1 fabric first, and that's sort of my my base, my foundation piece, so to speak. So I'm going to add a little dab of glue on the back of my template where it says in the A1 section, and put it down and use that to help keep my fabric in place while I'm sewing. You could use a pen. I like glue. It's just a little bit easier. So let me do that. And grab my glue pen. I'll just add a little dab. And then I'm going to place my fabric, and it's going to be wrong side of the template, wrong side fabric, because remember, we're building it backwards. So I can hold it up to the light a little bit here and see that I've got a nice seam allowance all the way around. I know y'all can't quite tell, but my fabric also extends past this dotted seam line on all sides. So that's great. I'm going to go ahead and do and get my first piece down, my A1, my number one piece down on all of my templates, so that I don't get confused, and I'll have the right fabric to start with. So A1 is going to be my cream background. F1 is going to be the next cream background piece. So I'll grab my F1 template here, and I'll grab my cream piece, and I'm going to go ahead and glue that down. Check my placement. Pretty good. Okay. So that one's done. Add a little bit more. No, it's good. Okay. Now the next one around with the cream piece is going to be H1. I have that one right here. So let me grab another number one piece. Wrong sides together. Okay, that one looks good. And okay, H1, and then the next one is going to be C1. So let me grab that one. Do the same thing. Here, E1 is going to be, I'm using the pink for E1. So let me grab my E segment, and I'll grab pink. Let me do all of the ones with the pink segments. Now I won't be so confused when I'm starting to look through all of my pieces. So I've already got the first piece down for all of them, and it'll make it a whole lot faster. So now I know that when I get to a pink one, I'm going to have the light green with it. So I'll just go ahead and put my light green fabrics here. And then with my cream backgrounds, I've got the dark green. So now we can move to the sewing machine and get going. Okay, so we've got A1 placed. So now we're ready to add A2. And in my case, that's going to be the green fabric. So foundation paper piecing is like a fancy kind of stitch and flip. So we want A2 to essentially be here, right? So we're actually going to flip it over, right sides together, line up that edge, and then we're going to work with a short stitch length and stitch on the line between A1 and A2. Okay, getting everything lined up. I've got my stitch length shortened. I'm going to do a little back stitch at the start and end of my seam. That's it. So now, when I flip this over, perfect. So I'm going to take this to my pressing station. I'm going to trim this just a little bit and press this out, and we'll be ready to move to the next piece. Okay, I trimmed my seam allowance here, and I did that just by folding this back and putting my ruler, to measure 1/4 inch and just trimming along the ruler that way. And then I pressed using a hot dry iron, no steam needed on this part. So now I'm ready to add A3. So I'll grab that piece, and let's see, it wants to go like this. So I'm gonna line it up this way along that seam allowance, along that edge here, so that when I stitch and flip, oops, nope, see, right sides together. There we go, that's better. There we go. So now when I stitch and flip, it'll be correct. This is why we practice. Okay, and we're gonna use a short stitch length and sew on the line between A1 and A3. Now, why do we use a short stitch length? We do that to make it easier to tear the paper off when we're done. So a shorter stitch perforates the paper a little bit more and keeps our seam secure when we tear the paper. All right, so let's sew that piece. And there we go. Okay, now we're ready to add the final piece. That's A4, so it's gonna go like this. So I'll flip that down. These I cut a little bit larger, I think, so it should be good to kind of line up. I'll just line up just a little bit under that edge. And now we're going to sew the line between A1 and A4. So we've just worked our way all around that center piece. And perfect. Now I'm going to trim that seam allowance again and press this out. And our first segment will be done. Okay, I've gone ahead and sewn all of my template pieces. So as you can see on the front, they look kind of like a hot mess, but that's okay because we're going to trim them. So remember that the dotted line here is your seam allowance. So, and remember when we cut out our templates, we just did a rough cut, and I cut beyond the seam allowance because I knew that I was going to be trimming down on this line. So I didn't want to get too close anyway. So even though I don't quite reach the edge of my paper template on some of these pieces, it's okay because I have reached the seam allowance. So we'll see when we trim these all down that it's going to work out just fine. And so when we start to assemble, just like we did sewing this part, these pieces together, we're going to sew right on this line. So we'll have our seam allowance built in. Okay, so let's trim all of these up and then we can start assembling the block. I don't like using a rotary blade on these kinds of little things, so snips work just fine. Okay, all of my segments are trimmed, and now I'm ready to start sewing these together. So in the seam allowance, I've added instructions to help guide you in assembling the segments. And I cannot take credit for this idea. I don't do a lot of paper piecing personally, so I'm certainly not that clever at it. But one of our designers who is going to be bringing us a block a little later in this group, she did this for her template. So spoiler alert, you're going to have some more foundation paper piecing coming down the line. But anyway, she did that with hers, and I thought it was so clever that I wanted to incorporate that in these templates as well. So join A to B, and so you know that along this line we're going to join A to B, right? So remember, wrong sides, or fabric right sides together. Yeah, so just like that. And now we're going to sew along this line, and that's going to give us our AB segment. And now you can see how this works on the template. Now you see, or in your fabric diagram, now there's A here, right? And it makes a little more sense. All right, so once again, we're going to sew with our short stitch length this long seam line. Okay, and so you can kind of see in here, if you peel these back, you can see where make sure your pieces are lined up, just like extra confirmation that your pieces are lined up. All right, and so now we'll sew these together. And let's take a look. There we go. So now I can press these open. Now, full disclaimer, at this juncture, I will go ahead and remove the paper from this seam allowance. I don't need the bulk when I start to join my these units together. So I'm gonna remove those, and then I will press seams open. I am a seam open presser. So, but now we can kind of start to see
our pretty block come together. So let's go ahead and sew these other ones. So like I said, I'm going to go ahead and remove the the paper from the seam allowance, because I just am not crazy about having all that paper and bulk when I start to join the segments together, the units together. So I'm going to trim my threads. As I mentioned before, this is where it's really nice if you have like manila paper or paper specifically for foundation paper piecing. It tears a little bit easier, but I've used regular copy paper here, and it's not the end of the world. That just makes it a little bit better when I'm trying to assemble my blocks. It's just a little bit lighter. There's a lot of overlapping pieces there. So I just gently tear away. And the great thing at this point is that we've already trimmed that seam allowance for the segment, so I don't have any more trimming to do. So if all goes according to plan, when I'm done with all of this, I won't have to trim my block at all, which I think is one of the great things about paper piecing, is that your block ends up the right size. Assuming you've printed your paper the right size, then you should end up with a block that's the right size, because you've got seam lines to follow, and it makes it very easy. I think that's why a lot of people really like paper piecing, is the precision that you get with it. And it definitely does result in a nice tidy block. Especially once you get the hang of it. All right, I'm going to press these open. All right, I've got my pieces, my units here pressed open. And now we'll join AB to CD. So along that line. And by the way, at this point I did use steam for pressing these open. So that's how they got nice and flat. We're close enough to the finish line that I think it's okay. It doesn't warp the paper too much to use a little bit of steam just to get it really good and flat there, because there's a little bit of bulk right there. So we'll sew AB to CD along this line, and then EF to GH along this line. And I know that I have covered up the start of my seam line there with my open seam allowance, but I can ballpark it. I know about where it is. All right, let's sew these together. All right, same thing. I'm going to remove my papers here. Now, I think I'm going to press my seams open again, because I just prefer that with all this bulk. And everything should line up pretty well. I'm not too worried about nesting the seams, so I'm going to press these seams open. Okay, so now we are joining ABCD to EFGH. And once again, we're going to stitch along this long seam line, and that'll be our final seam for this block. Time for the big reveal. Yay! So there we have it, our paper pieced block.
So once again, I'm going to snip my threads. The peril of using steam, as you can see, my ink is running just a little bit. So I'm going to remove this last bit of paper from the seam allowance, and I'll press that seam open. Now, I'm sure many of you are going to ask, do you leave the paper, the rest of the paper in? And if you do, for how long? Or do you leave it in, or do you take it out now, or do you wait till you have sewn it into your final piece? And that I don't really, I think there's different ways of doing it. I think it's kind of up to preference. For me, I think it's more tedious to remove all the papers once it's been sewn into a quilt top. Then you're having to work through and manhandle your quilt top. I prefer not to do that. So for me, I would probably remove these before I sewed it into remove the papers before I sewed it into my final block. But it just kind of depends on what or my final quilt rather, but it just kind of depends on what your plan is. And it's just kind of comes down to personal preference. So I'm going to press this open, and then we'll have our finished paper piece block. Stellar Elegance by Brigitte of Zen Chic.
Okay, I hope that was a helpful tutorial. Thanks for watching. If you're finding us on YouTube, please make sure to join us on our Facebook group. I'll put the link in the comments below. And then if you're watching us on the Facebook group, we're so glad you're part of the group. Don't forget to post your finished blocks to the group and put them in the album for this week's blocks. Can't wait to see all the great blocks that y'all make this week. Thank you so much for being part of Blockheads, and we'll see you next week.